What's up YouTube? Welcome back to another tier list video. With all of the new players coming into the franchise, along with the past Fire Emblem protagonist features showcased within the emblems, I figured I'd do my part to help new players choose their next Fire Emblem game to play. I'll be going in chronological order starting from Fire Emblem 1 up to Fire Emblem 16. This list won't be very in-depth, but more of a quick showcase of all the previous Fire Emblem games for you to explore yourself. Before I begin, I like to ask all of the Fire Emblem veterans which game introduced you to the series. Personally, I started playing Sacred Stones when I was a kid and I've played every entry from there. For new players, which Fire Emblem game outside of Engage intrigues you the most? Let me know down below. Lastly, it should go without being said that this is strictly opinion based and there will be little to no spoilers to each game. To kick things off, we'll be starting with none other than Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and Blade of Light. I'm putting the first 4 titles in the Classics category as these games are pretty old, releasing as early as 1990. However, since this game does have a remake called Shadow Dragon, I'll be slapping the remake in as well as I don't see a point to talk about the same game twice. I don't particularly suggest anyone to play any of the first 4 games unless you like retro-esque games. Regardless, they're still fun games to play eventually. I'll be placing the remake in A tier. I'm sure there are many Marth fans, or at the very least many people who are curious about Marth from Engage. Well, this first entry follows Marth after he flees his home at a young age due to an enemy invasion. He hides away in a neighboring nation called Talus, where he will train until the day when he is ready to take back his home. Except he doesn't have much of a choice, as it would only be a few years later when Talus is now under attack. Marth, with all of his training, ends up repelling the enemy forces and begins his journey to take back his homeland. This game is 26 chapters and they're all relatively short, taking up to an hour at maximum. Compared to the later titles, specifically Engage, some chapters can take up to 3 hours, so it's a fairly quick game. Since it's the first Fire Emblem game, I believe that all Fire Emblem fans should eventually check out where it all started. To play any of the older Fire Emblems, you basically just have to Google them and you can fortunately just play them in your browser. You're able to create save points on either the site or download the save to your device. I highly recommend this game for beginners as it basically showcases where it all began. Next up we have Fire Emblem Gaiden, which released 2 years later in 1992. I personally haven't played this one, but I have played the remake and I assume it's very similar. I'll be placing the remake in C tier. It starts in a small village home to Alm and Celica. One day when the village was attacked, an older knight that protected over Celica decided that it wasn't safe for her anymore and it was time to leave. Alm and Celica are basically a love story and they're torn apart from each other. You play 2 different routes, following both Alm and Celica respectively. There are 5 chapters in total, but it works a bit differently as chapters, and this game marks more of a checkpoint in the story. You need to complete multiple battles for both Alm and Celica in order to advance to the next chapter. The rewind feature is present in this game, so it may be a bit easier, but I'm personally not a fan of echoes, mainly due to the maps lacking a lot of detail. Most of the maps are just completely open and ends up being a full head-on collision and not many mechanics to work around with. You just need to train up your units to be able to tank hits and kill very quickly in order to not lose units, and I didn't find that very fun. However, the story is pretty interesting, so it's definitely worth a shot eventually. Next is Fire Emblem Mystery of the Emblem and New Mystery of the Emblem. New Mystery of the Emblem is the remake of the original game, so I'll be placing that in C tier. This is mainly due to the fact that it is a sequel of the events of the first game, or the remake version, Shadow Dragon, so I don't suggest new players to hop right into this game without playing the first one. I believe there are 23 chapters, with some having multiple parts along with prologues. It equates to about 40 hours of gameplay, but like I said, I really don't recommend this for new players. Next is Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War. This game unfortunately doesn't have a remake yet, but the quality in the games begins to step up in the classics, in my opinion. It follows the events of 2 protagonists, both Sigurd and his son Seliph. It's a fun game with an interesting story, but is a relatively short game chapter-wise, but still takes a bit of time to complete. Even though I'm putting this in Classic, I highly suggest that you guys check this game out at one point or another. Next up, I'll be talking about both the Binding Blade and Blazing Blade. We're moving away from the Classics and into the Game Boy games. The Binding Blade is actually the sequel to Blazing Blade, even though it was released previously. I suggest playing Blazing Blade first if you'd like to be in the correct order of the events. I'll be placing Blazing Blade in B with Binding Blade in C tier. Amazing games that showcase what the OG Fire Emblem fans love to see in the games. As for the story, Blazing Blade follows Lyn, Eliwood, and Hector. You get to play as all of them for the most part, but only Lyn was carried over into the Engage game. The 3 lords team up to find Eliwood's missing father while running into a nation threatening the borders of their own country. That basically explains the conflict within this game. As for Binding Blade, it takes place 20 years after Blazing Blade, and you play as Eliwood's son, Roy. Without spoiling too much, the events of Blazing Blade dictate the antagonist of this game, so it's an interesting plot twist. Both are amazing games with high replayability and worth your time. I recommend checking them out. Next is the reason I ranked the 2 previously legendary games low is because I believe that the next game is much more suited for new players. This game is called Fire Emblem Sacred Stones, and I'll be placing it in S tier. It follows the story of Erica and Ephraim after their nation of Radiance was invaded by longtime ally, the Grotto Empire. Ephraim stuck behind enemy lines. Erica manages to flee the castle to safety alongside her knight Seth. If you're curious why Grotto invaded one of their most trusted allies, you have to check out this game yourself. This game has amazing storytelling and gameplay, but it's also regarded as one of the easier Fire Emblem games. If for whatever reason you're stuck, you're able to go to the Tower of Valentia to train up your units. That means even new players can beat the game on the hardest difficulty if trained enough. The game is pretty short, only having 21 chapters, but technically 29 depending on which route you pick, which means you have to play the game twice to discover every chapter. However, you unlock the Lake Dew Ruins after completing the game, so there's still some fun content to play in the post-game. Especially if you're a fan of Erica and Ephraim, this would be my recommendation for most players. Next up is Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn. Radiant Dawn being the sequel to Path of Radiance. I'll be placing Path of Radiance in B tier, with Radiant Dawn in C tier. This is due to my previous beliefs of playing the original game before the sequel. Path of Radiance takes place following Ike, the son of Grail, who is the leader of the Grail mercenaries. It's difficult to say too much as to not spoil anything, since the main plot twist happens early in the game. But Ike, one way or another, steps up to lead the Grail mercenaries. The main objective is to put the princess onto the throne and regain control of a war happening. This game introduces shapeshifters in the form of birds and cats. It's an interesting dynamic and shocked me the first time I played it. The game has 28 chapters plus an endgame, so it's pretty lengthy. I won't be going into too much detail about the sequel, Radiant Dawn, but it is by far the longest Fire Emblem game to date, having a total of 43 chapters and many of the chapters requiring you to rout or kill all enemies on the map. An interesting story, but the gameplay isn't the greatest in my opinion. Next up is the game that revived the franchise. Fire Emblem Awakening was meant to be the last Fire Emblem game, but after it did so well, they were given the all clear to continue the production of the games. I think it'd be a crime not to put this game in S tier, due to the sole fact that the new players purchasing this game are the only reason we're able to play Engage today. It follows the events of Chrom, Robin, and Lucina, whom we might recognize from Engage. Chrom is a descendant of the OG Marth, and Lucina is Chrom's daughter. You can tell just by looking at them, Marth has some pretty strong genes. Similar to most Fire Emblem games, there's a war taking place with an underlying secret that you have to play to understand yourself. This game does really well in the storytelling and gameplay departments, along with some fun characters to play with as well. There are 25 chapters in this game, along with some paralogs, which gives a lot of content to choose from. Not to mention, skirmishes are in this game as well, so you're often choosing where to go next, whether it be to continue the story, do a skirmish, or an optional paralog. What is interesting in Awakening is that it introduced recruitable children into the game. This meant that if you achieve the highest support rank possible with a male and female character, you're able to unlock a paralog with their child. Upon completing that paralog, you will be able to use their kid in your army. I definitely recommend this if you're looking for an amazing Fire Emblem game, but would prefer to stay away from the pixelated graphics of Sacred Stones. Next is Fire Emblem Fates, which actually has 3 routes or games entirely to choose from. I'll be placing Conquest and Birthright in A tier, along with Revelations in D tier. It's no spoiler to say that these different branches dictate which army you choose to fight with. Although the story is pretty mediocre, I'm putting Conquest in A purely due to the amazingly fun gameplay. I should note that Conquest is typically tailored for more experienced Fire Emblem players, while Birthright is tailored to new players. It basically comes down to whichever you decide, honestly. The story pretty much follows the same thing regardless. The main difference is that you get to choose your army and enemies for the most part. However, I'm placing Revelations in D tier as it feels more like a cop-out and very bland compared to the other 2 games. When you're at the crossroad of fate and you decide Conquest or Birthright, you also have the option to not pick either side. This results in you basically recruiting everyone from both armies while still fighting the same main antagonist of the game. It's typically the branch you choose after you've already played Conquest and Birthright. I should also note that this game does continue the Children Paralogs, which was a fan favorite for those who played Awakening. So if that interests you, feel free to check out Fates. Last but not least, we have Fire Emblem Three Houses. This game follows Byleth as he becomes a professor at the monastery. I'm just going to start off and say although I believe this to be an amazing game, it is simply not tailored to new players in the slightest. The teaching mechanic is way too complicated to understand for new players, so I'm putting it in B tier. If you use this game to learn all the ins and outs of Fire Emblem, it could be a good learning opportunity, but I recommend just saving yourself the headache and just learning the game through experience playing the previous games. In terms of gameplay, I find Gambits to be a very fun mechanic and overall just a fun game to play in general. However, the story feels very hollow and the protagonist is extremely dull. He rarely ever talks and ever shows emotion, so it just really feels like he's off most of the time. But the game does have a total of 4 different branches and somewhat high replayability, which is what they were going for. However, the devs created so many mandatory quests in the monastery that you have to do after each chapter, which is fine for your first run, but after your third or fourth, it becomes extremely dull just doing the same thing each time. There was a point where I knew exactly which quest I had to do after the upcoming chapter in the monastery, and I was dreading it, but it's required for the rewards. So the devs messed up in that aspect, but in terms of gameplay, I find it fun. I like to note that there are still 2 more Fire Emblem games here excluding Engage, but these are the Warriors line. It's basically just a hack and slash where you press the same button on your controller for 30 hours. They're not real Fire Emblem games, but if you like hack and slashes, feel free to check the titles out. I've personally never played them and don't really support them, but everyone enjoys different things. With that being said, I hope that some of the new players in the series enjoy the advice and look forward to y'all becoming Fire Emblem veterans of yourself one day. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really does help out a ton.